Hi, Susan. It is great to see you. So I am now working at Yale and US College. I'm professor in philosophy and have been here almost since the college started. It started in 2014. 13. I've been here since 2014. I teach ancient Greek philosophy and Indian philosophy, mostly Buddhist, Indian Buddhist, and ethics, particularly
Remind,
from the two traditions.
remind us for the people who only hear the Yale part of that sentence that you are in Singapore. This is in
That's right. Sorry, Yale and US
Singapore.
in Singapore. It's a new liberal arts college founded by Yale University and the National University of Singapore and US to create a new kind of institution in Singapore. It's new to Asia, of course, from the Yale perspective, to perpetuate and try to rehabilitate and breathe new life into the liberal arts in particular and make it more globally oriented. So one of the things that was exciting for me about this whole project and what brought me out here to a place that I hadn't really thought I would be living in is the opportunity to really rethink and update liberal arts from a global perspective, to retain the tradition, but also to make it relevant and a living tradition into the future for the 21st century.
So tell me a bit about what you were doing before you got the Einstein Fellowship. I remember very well the board meeting in which we decided to award it to you, at which Brighton Breitenbach, who at the time was a member of our board and one of the jury, said, well, this is the first time someone has ever committed professional suicide by committee. Can you explain a little?
Yeah.
It didn't happily happen, but we were afraid of that.
Yes, yes, and with every reason, really. So I had I had a background in ancient Greek philosophy, and in my personal intellectual life, I had interest in Buddhism and Indian Buddhism in particular, but I'd never really had the opportunity to pursue it seriously. I had studied Sanskrit while I was writing my PhD on Plato's Philebus, right? So doing serious Greek philosophy, and by the way, up the road at SOAS, doing Sanskrit just to keep myself sane and see some people who are different. And my PhD supervisor said, very sensibly, Amber, just finish the PhD. And at each stage, it was, just get yourself a job, just get yourself some publications, get some runs on the board as an ancient philosopher. So there I was, some years out of my PhD, and I was a straight down the line ancient philosopher, working primarily in Plato's ethics, metaphysics, epistemology. And as far as my CV was concerned, that's what I was. But as far as my intellectual interests were concerned, I had this sort of dialectic going on in my mind with Indian Buddhist philosophy, about which I at that point had only an informal familiarity. And Plato's ethical epistemology and ethically driven metaphysics. So at the point that I was in my career when the Einstein Forum, when the Einstein Fellowship came to my attention, I was really at a crossroads. Either I was going to keep going down this pretty familiar path of being an ancient Greek philosopher, and we know what that looks like, you know who you talk to, who your interlocutors are, what your opportunities are, or I was going to jump ship. I was going to do something that my ancient philosophy colleagues could not recognize as in any way related to what they were doing, and that my philosophy colleagues also couldn't recognize as in any way related to what they were doing, but which also wasn't in any way area studies, so that anybody doing South Asian studies also wouldn't recognize it as anything related to what they were doing. So, of course, being what I am temperamentally, I chose the option, if at all possible, of jumping ship and doing something that nobody could possibly recognize as being related to what they were doing, and hence Breitenbach's characterization of it as career suicide.
Well, it actually made you, if dare I say, the platonic form of the Einstein Fellow. We don't of course, demand or even expect that the 6 months that we give people to take time off from whatever they've been doing before necessarily turn into an alternate career path. But if it does, it allows you to realize what you, um, you know, a strange off the path, off the road, out of the box kind of career. It's fantastic.
Yeah.
Can you say just a little bit more about, you were at the time you were comparing and trying to show, I remember your lecture fairly well, points of continuity between Buddhist and Greek ethics. Can you just say a few words about that?
Yeah,
And
sure.
metaphysics, of course. So you're someone who, and I share your belief that you can't entirely detach metaphysics and ethics.
Yeah. So I am somebody who something always slightly dies inside of me when people use the word comparative with respect to what I do.
Oh,
Um,
okay.
no, that's okay, because it's methodologically it is really different from what people expect. But it's what's been so important about what I do and the way in which it has been sort of determining of my profile, my intellectual profile and career path and so on, that my aim is to bring the Indian Buddhists into the philosophical conversation in just the same way that we bring Plato and Aristotle into the philosophical conversation. So some people just do history of philosophy. They just think, isn't it cool and weird what these old dead guys used to think? And that's fine, and let a thousand flowers bloom if that's the way you work. And it's not the way I work. I think, like, how can we do philosophy with these people? If I can do philosophy, it's because my primary philosophical interlocutor has been Plato, right? And that's how I take it. And so my interest has been in how can we bring the Indian Buddhist philosophers into the philosophical conversation. And for me personally, because of my basis in Greek philosophy, it's been about how do we bring these two different traditions who have a kind of internal coherence and authenticity within their respective traditions. How do we bring them to philosophical conversation with each other in a way that's fruitful for us intellectually? And one of those points of contact that I identified at the end of my time at the Einstein Forum, a little bit after that actually, because I remember it was about a year since I started that I gave my talk, was on the area of why flux metaphysics matters ethically one way or another. Because for Plato, it's incredibly important that flux isn't all there is. It's morally important for him that that's not all there is. And for the Buddhists, it's just the opposite. It's morally important for them that flux is fundamentally how things are. And so I wanted to tease out what they would say to each other, since they both care about it for the same kinds of reasons. If Buddhists were approached with a Platonic critique of the moral danger of flux, what would they have to say? If Plato were approached with the moral danger of what the Buddhists call eternalism, could he have something to say to that? And this hopefully to help us think through what our metaphysical commitments should be and how those are shaping and informing our ethical commitments or constraining them.
Wonderful. And so tell us a little bit about your journey from that point, sitting in Caputh, allowing yourself to do this study that you hadn't had time to do. Tell us where that led you. I mean, you did say a bit about it in your opening description of what you're doing in Singapore, but if you could say a bit more about your writing and the projects that you've been doing since then.
Yeah, thank you. So originally, the proximate aim, the nearest aim, was to be able to work seriously in Indian Buddhist philosophy. And that was the most immediate and obvious thing that my time in Caputh and the fellowship I then won on the back of that Einstein fellowship, that's what that allowed me to do. And so I had a contract actually before I finished my Einstein fellowship, or just around the time I was finishing it, had a contract to write Indian Buddhist philosophy in a series of history of philosophy books. And I was able gradually to come into contact with people in the profession. It was one of the difficult things that, not actually doing a PhD in the area, I had no formal contact with anybody working in the area. So I was able gradually to be able to contribute to conversations that were just about Buddhist ethics, metaphysics, and so on. One of the important contributions in this respect was a piece called Keeping Their Karma Together, about the Buddhist personalists. It's something that I actually drafted, the main drafting of it, just after my time as an Einstein Fellow, so just sort of 6 months afterwards, and on the back of the work that I'd been able to do in Berlin. And so that was something that occupied a number of years. And that was like, in a way, I think of it as getting my second horse up to scratch, putting it through its paces and getting it ready. But the aim was always to be able to yoke these two horses together to ride sort of a philosophical chariot that's being led by both of these equally. And in coming to Singapore, one of the reasons, I fitted the institution just so obviously was because I do Greek philosophy and I do Indian philosophy, each in their own right, for their own sakes. And this is something very unusual. You have people that dabble, but not usually people who are engaging seriously in both. But my personal intellectual aim was to finally realize the philosophical conversation of these two coming together. And that's been something that I've been able to do more over the past few years since I've been here, to work still on Plato for his own sake, to work still on the Indian Buddhists for their own sake, but more importantly, to really articulate and spell out these points of contact. So I've been doing that in my own individual work, which has been really exciting. The one that I am very fond of now is The Ethics of Atomism, which looks at Democritus's atomism and his arguments that led him to it, and what the ethical implications of that are, and the way it leads to a kind of inadvertent skepticism, which can be ethically dubious or problematic, or else it leads to a sort of Platonism, which is not what Democritus intended. And contrasting that with the way that Vasubandhu gets to his atomism, the arguments that lead him there don't lead naturally to skepticism or Platonism. They lead to a really quite different practical sort of implication. So that's the bit I'm working on now. But the other project that I've got is trying to create more of a community, because it turns out there's a fair handful of people working in Greek philosophy and a fair handful of people working in Indian philosophy who have background in and interest in the other tradition, but no opportunity to actually pursue the two in tandem. And they're seeing these connections on their own, but don't have a chance to pursue them. So I limited it to Indian Buddhism and to Platonism, and have got together a group of 12 scholars internationally across 16 time zones, which I know very well because we've been meeting monthly virtually between Singapore and Vancouver and all points in between, to create a kind of conversation so that we can responsibly have very high-level, sophisticated philosophical discussions that are also in tune with where the research is in each of the respective fields. So sharing with each other what's out there in terms of the primary text, in terms of how scholars have already discussed our particular respective traditions, so that any individual one of us who has an interest in making a particular connection can then pursue that in a way that's methodologically sound and informed. It also has feedback both from the Indian side and from the Greek side. So we've been at it for about a year now, an academic year. And we're moving now into phase 2, which is going to look a bit different than planned because of COVID. And but we've now moved into the phase where people will pursue their individual projects and points of connection that are arising out of this joint conversation and dialogue that we've created.
That sounds wonderful, Amber. Look, both of us are philosophers, And we're able, I think, to gauge just how unusual and radical this is within philosophy. I wonder if you could say something for people who aren't philosophers about, and this will sound, I know, rather vague and rather large, ways in which you think this could contribute to an understanding of East-West worldviews. I know that's for
Mm-hmm.
philosopher, it's too vague a term, but I wonder if
Mm-hmm.
you've had any thoughts about that. Because as I understand, the college that you're teaching in Singapore is actually devoted to exactly that mission.
Yes, yes, and I think let me think for a minute about how best to approach this. So there's a terrible temptation, I think, to um, to create the unknown as something really radically different from what's familiar, and therefore unapproachable by me and just somehow different. And this can be done both by people who are um, hostile to the foreign or the alien and people who are attracted to it. Right? There can be a temptation in both cases to create it as something somehow just so different, and there's no connecting lines and there's no overlap, and I think that's really unfruitful for genuine dialogue. In genuine dialogue, it's like two people when they meet. They might come from however so different their backgrounds are, but they find some kind of common ground in one way or another. And their understandings might not match exactly, but the conversation is a process of coming to see and appreciate our different ways of using different concepts, different ways of making connections, different values, and so on. And I think that activity of rapprochement, of somebody who looks, two people who seem foreign to each other, coming to discover that they can actually have a conversation is absolutely essential to life going forward. Actually to life on the planet going forward, because the issue that we face is a global one. The issue that we face is something that cannot be addressed without people who speak different languages, have different cultural touchstones and different orientation points, having a conversation with each other. So that's the very broadest way. I think there are some specific things, and they're very general, but to me they're helpful. That I get out of the kinds of sort of dialogical work that I do in particular, which is to do with the Buddhist de-emphasis of self and the corresponding de-emphasis on blame. Now, I don't want to say that this is true throughout all of Asia and Asian thought, but it probably isn't an unfair characterization of quite a lot of Asian thought, Confucian thought, the non-Buddhist Indian thought. A lot of it de-emphasizes self, and by de-emphasizing self, tends to de-emphasize blame and the process of finding blame and feeling resentment and indignation. Quite a lot of the Asian tradition, Japanese, Chinese, and so on, puts a very high value on getting rid of indignation and resentment. And I think one of the most important things that can be learned, if you like, from a Anglo-European right-centered perspective that's really conscious about justice and for good reasons, and we know why, and it is important. One of the things that they could usefully learn is how to not conceive of this in terms of self and blame, and not conceive of the project as one of finding out where to point the finger, but instead one of finding out how to make things go better in the future.